The dawn of revolution. The story of the American Revolution does not begin with muskets firing at Lexington or a parchment signed in Philadelphia. It begins with an idea, a whisper across the winds of the Atlantic, a sense that something was deeply wrong in the way empires ruled over people. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire stretched across the globe. Its navy ruled the seas, its colonies provided wealth, and its king sat proudly on the throne in London. To most of the world, Britain looked invincible. Yet, on the far side of the ocean, in 13 relatively small colonies hugging the North American coastline, unrest was growing. For decades, these colonies had enjoyed a degree of autonomy. Local assemblies governed daily life, merchants thrived on trade, and farmers worked their land with little interference. But after the costly 7 Years' War, Britain sought to tighten control and extract more revenue. Taxes like the Stamp Act and the Tea Act were not just economic burdens, they were insults to the colonists' sense of liberty. Here, in taverns, meeting halls, and town squares, debates erupted. Pamphlets circulated, sermons were preached, and fiery speeches were delivered. Men like Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson argued that liberty was not a gift from kings but a natural right. Still, few could imagine that their protests would ignite a revolution with global consequences. After all, these colonies were but a speck compared to the vastness of Britain. Yet revolutions often begin in unlikely places. On April 19, 1775, gunfire broke out at Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world was not only the start of a war, but the beginning of a story that would ripple across oceans and continents. What began as a colonial struggle for fair treatment soon transformed into a worldwide debate. Could ordinary people challenge empires and win? Could liberty spread beyond the boundaries of kings and monarchies? The answer would not come quickly. It would be written in blood, in fiery speeches, in secret letters carried across seas, and in the imaginations of men and women who longed for change. The American Revolution was not merely America's fight. It was the spark that set the world ablaze. Colonial America before independence. To truly understand the global impact of American independence, one must first look closely at the world of the colonies before the storm. The 13 colonies were not yet united. They were a patchwork of communities, each with its own culture, economy, and ambitions. In New England, small towns thrived on fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Puritan values emphasized hard work, education, and community responsibility. In the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, commerce flourished, and a diverse population of Dutch, English, Germans, and Quakers lived side by side. Farther south, in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, vast plantations dominated, worked by enslaved Africans whose labor fueled the wealth of the landowning elite. Daily life in these colonies carried both promise and hardship. Farmers rose with the sun, blacksmiths hammered iron in smoky workshops, merchants bustled in seaports like Boston and Philadelphia, while enslaved men and women toiled in silence under the whip. Politically, the colonies had grown accustomed to managing their own affairs. Each colony had an assembly, elected by property-owning men, that passed local laws and managed taxes. These assemblies were small exercises in democracy, limited but significant. The colonists believed they had rights as Englishmen: the right to trial by jury, the right to be taxed only with their consent, and the right to local self-rule. But across the ocean, the British Crown saw things differently. To London, the colonies were subjects, sources of raw materials and markets for British goods. Britain's policy of mercantilism demanded that the colonies serve the empire's economic needs, not their own ambitions. This difference in perspective slowly grew into tension. When Britain attempted to enforce new taxes and trade restrictions after 1763, colonists saw it not as governance, but as tyranny. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and later the Tea Act struck nerves not just because of the money, but because they violated a principle: no taxation without representation. The intellectual climate of the time also shaped colonial thought. Ideas from the Enlightenment, the works of John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, circulated widely. Locke's argument that governments derive power from the consent of the governed became a rallying cry. If government existed to protect life, liberty, and property, Then what happened when it failed? The colonists began to whisper. Was rebellion justified? Religious diversity also played a role. Unlike Europe, where state churches dominated, the colonies had a mix of faiths: Puritans, Quakers, Catholics, Baptists. This pluralism created an early sense of tolerance and freedom of conscience, ideas that would later be woven into the fabric of independence. Thus, by the eve of revolution, America was already fertile ground for radical change. Its people were divided by class, race, and region, yet united by a growing belief that they were something more than mere subjects of a distant king. They were colonists no longer, they were Americans in the making. When the first protests erupted in Boston, London may have dismissed them as local disturbances. But in reality, the colonies had been preparing, culturally, politically, and intellectually, for a moment of rupture. The revolution was not an accident. It was the natural outcome of a people ready to define their own destiny. The break with Britain. By the early 1770s, the relationship between Britain and its colonies had reached a breaking point. What had once been seen as a proud connection to the British crown was now increasingly viewed as a chain that bound America's future. The trigger came with Britain's attempt to assert direct authority over the colonies after the costly 7 Years' War. The empire had fought to protect its territories in North America, and now it expected the colonists to help pay the bill. Taxes on sugar, stamps, glass, paint, paper, and tea poured out of Parliament in London. To British officials, these were modest levies. To American colonists, they were intolerable symbols of oppression. The cry rose, "No taxation without representation." Colonists argued that since they had no elected representatives in Parliament, any taxes imposed by London were illegitimate. In Britain's eyes, Parliament represented all subjects of the empire. In America's eyes, only their local assemblies could rightfully tax them. Protests erupted across the colonies. Pamphlets circulated, none more powerful than Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. Paine, a radical Englishman who had only recently arrived in America, wrote in simple, passionate language that kings were not divine rulers but parasites upon the people. His words spread like wildfire. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. This idea, that America's struggle was not local but universal, would become the Revolution's greatest legacy. The situation escalated into open confrontation. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, when Parliament granted the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, angry colonists staged the Boston Tea Party, dumping shiploads of tea into the harbor. Britain responded harshly with the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, closing Boston's port and revoking Massachusetts' charter. Instead of isolating the rebels, this only united the colonies. In 1774, delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, the first step toward national unity. By 1775, war was unavoidable. The clashes at Lexington and Concord proved that armed conflict had begun. Yet even then, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III, pleading for peace. The king, however, dismissed them as traitors. The door to compromise was closed. Independence was now the only path. In the summer of 1776, the colonies gathered once again in Philadelphia. This time, there would be no half measures. A committee, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston, drafted a declaration. On July 4, 1776, the United States of America was born. The break with Britain was more than political, it was philosophical. It was a statement that governments derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not the power of monarchs. This was a dangerous idea not just for Britain, but for every empire and monarchy in the world. The sound of independence echoed not only across the Atlantic, but into the hearts of people in Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. A new age was beginning, and America had fired the opening shot. The Declaration of Independence, words that shook the world. On a hot summer day in Philadelphia, in July 1776, men gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, later known as Independence Hall. They were nervous, restless, but determined. What they were about to do was not only dangerous, it was unprecedented. The committee chosen to draft a declaration had given the primary task to a tall, quiet Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. With quill in hand, Jefferson distilled decades of colonial frustration and centuries of philosophical debate into a single, powerful document. He wrote not only for America but for all of humanity. The Declaration of Independence begins with words that would forever change history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was not the language of kings, parliaments, or even laws. It was the language of universal principles, a bold claim that rights come not from monarchs, but from nature itself. Governments, Jefferson wrote, exist only to protect those rights, and if they fail, the people have not only a right but a duty to overthrow them. The delegates debated Jefferson's words, cutting, adding, and refining, but the essence remained. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration. Bells rang, cannons fired, and newspapers rushed to print copies. Across the colonies, it was read aloud in town squares, where crowds cheered, wept, or prayed. The United States was born. Yet, the Declaration was more than an internal announcement. It was a message to the world. It was meant for Britain's enemies, especially France and Spain, who might now see America not as rebellious colonies but as a sovereign nation worth supporting. It was also meant for posterity, a declaration that liberty was not confined to America alone, but a cause of mankind. The impact was immediate. In Europe, philosophers and reformers devoured the text. In Paris, Voltaire's followers saw it as proof that Enlightenment ideas could be turned into action. In Germany and Italy, intellectuals reprinted its words. Even in Britain, radicals circulated the document, using it to challenge their own government. But the Declaration also carried contradictions. The ringing words of equality did not apply to everyone. Enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women were excluded. Jefferson himself owned slaves even as he wrote about liberty. This tension between ideals and reality would shape not only America's future but also how the world viewed its revolution. Still, the symbolic power of the Declaration was undeniable. It gave rebels in Latin America, slaves in Haiti, revolutionaries in France, and nationalists in Asia a text they could point to, a precedent that empires could be challenged. It was a weapon of words, and sometimes words are more dangerous than cannons. Empires could defeat armies, but how could they silence an idea once it had been declared to the world? The Declaration of Independence was, at its heart, not just an American document. It was humanity's boldest proclamation up to that time, a promise that would inspire generations to come. The Revolutionary War and global reactions. When war broke out in 1775 at Lexington and Concord, few could have imagined that the struggle of a handful of colonies would capture the world's imagination. The Revolutionary War, fought over the next 8 years, was not just a civil conflict. It became an international spectacle. The American rebels faced the British Empire, the most powerful military force on earth. Redcoats, disciplined and well-equipped, expected an easy victory. The colonists, by contrast, had militias of farmers and tradesmen, poorly supplied and often poorly trained. Yet, they possessed something the British lacked: a fierce commitment to liberty and local knowledge of the terrain. Early victories, like the Battle of Bunker Hill and the surprise attack on Trenton, demonstrated that the Americans could fight and even win against formidable odds. These victories were symbolic, showing Europe that rebellion against a major empire was not impossible. The war soon drew global attention. France, eager to avenge its losses in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity. The American struggle became a proxy war. By supporting the colonies, France could weaken Britain without a direct conflict on French soil. Secret shipments of arms and money flowed to the Americans, and eventually, in 1778, France declared war on Britain openly. Spain and the Dutch Republic also joined the conflict, not necessarily out of love for liberty, but to regain territories and counter British power. Suddenly, what had begun as a colonial revolt became a worldwide military struggle. Europe watched closely, both with hope and fear. If America could defy Britain, could similar revolts spark at home? The involvement of foreign officers further internationalized the war. Marquis de Lafayette, a young French nobleman, became a trusted aide to George Washington. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, trained the Continental Army in discipline and strategy. Their contributions not only strengthened the American forces but also connected the revolution to European military culture. News of American successes traveled fast. Newspapers in London debated the wisdom of the war. In Paris, salons buzzed with excitement. Radical thinkers, already influenced by Enlightenment ideals, hailed America as proof that government could be accountable to the people. The revolution became a symbol of hope for oppressed populations worldwide. Yet the war was brutal. Thousands of soldiers died from battle, disease, and hardship. Civilians suffered, especially in contested regions. Loyalists, those loyal to Britain, were often targeted, forced to flee, or had their property seized. The conflict was not clean or simple. It was a war that reshaped societies as much as borders. By 1781, with the decisive British surrender at Yorktown, the revolution achieved what many had thought impossible. Britain recognized the independence of the United States in the Treaty of Paris, 1783. The world had changed. A colony had defeated an empire. The global reaction was profound. Monarchs feared that their subjects might rise in rebellion. Philosophers and revolutionaries celebrated the victory as proof that human beings could claim self-determination. The American Revolution was no longer an isolated event. It was a spark for global transformation. France steps in a new balance of power. The American Revolution quickly became more than a colonial struggle. It was a chessboard for global powers. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw a chance to weaken Britain. Supporting the Americans was risky, but the potential reward, diminishing British dominance, was too great to ignore. French aid began secretly, with money, weapons, and military advisors flowing to the colonies. Volunteers like Marquis de Lafayette brought not only expertise but also enthusiasm, rallying troops with the ideals of liberty. In 1778, France officially entered the war, transforming the rebellion into an international conflict. Spain and the Dutch Republic soon followed, turning North America into a theater of global rivalry. The British, once confident of a swift victory, now faced enemies on multiple fronts. French support was decisive at Yorktown, where coordinated Franco-American forces trapped British troops. This victory proved that alliances could shift the course of history. Beyond the battlefield, the French involvement sent shockwaves across Europe. It showed that empires were vulnerable and that the ideas of liberty and self-rule could inspire action far beyond one continent. The American Revolution had become a catalyst for global power shifts, a proof that the balance of empires could be challenged by courage, strategy, and ideals. The shockwaves in Britain and Europe. The news of American victories and eventual independence reverberated across Europe. In Britain, the ruling elite were shaken. How could a small group of colonies defeat the most powerful army and navy in the world? Radical thinkers in London seized upon the revolution to argue for reform, questioning the authority of the monarchy and parliament. Across France, intellectuals and citizens watched with excitement and envy. The success of the Americans proved that ordinary people could challenge kings and empires. Enlightenment ideas of liberty, equality, and self-government were no longer just theory. They had been tested and proven on the battlefield. In Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, political thinkers circulated newspapers and pamphlets praising the American example. Even monarchs feared its implications. The revolution planted a seed of anxiety in courts, worried that subjects might rise against injustice. The American Revolution also ignited debates in colonial territories around the world. People began questioning the legitimacy of distant rulers, imagining a world where governance could be based on the consent of the governed. In essence, America's fight for independence had a double impact. It weakened Britain internationally, while inspiring hope and fear in Europe. The revolution had become a model and a warning for the entire continent. The French Revolution, from inspiration to explosion. The American Revolution had proven that ordinary people could challenge a mighty empire. In France, this lesson did not go unnoticed. The nation was burdened by crushing debt, soaring food prices, and a rigid social hierarchy that favored the nobility and clergy. Ordinary citizens grew restless, demanding change. French soldiers and volunteers who had fought in America returned home inspired. Marquis de Lafayette, hailed as the hero of two worlds, spoke passionately about liberty, equality, and the rights of citizens. These ideas mingled with growing anger over economic hardship and royal extravagance, creating a volatile mix. By 1789, the tension exploded. The storming of the Bastille marked the start of the French Revolution. Crowds marched, nobles fled, and the king's power began to crumble. The principles that Americans had declared in 1776, self-governance, popular sovereignty, and human rights, became the rallying cries of the French people. However, the French Revolution went further and faster than the Americans. It overthrew the monarchy, executed the king, and challenged the very foundations of Europe's aristocratic order. While France embraced radical reform, monarchs across the continent watched in fear. The influence of the American Revolution was clear. It had planted the seed of change. But in France, that seed grew into a storm that shook the entire continent, demonstrating that revolutionary ideas could transcend borders and ignite entire nations. Latin America awakens, Bolívar and San Martín. The victory of the American colonies sent shockwaves far beyond the North Atlantic. In Latin America, where Spain and Portugal ruled vast territories, young revolutionaries read about the events in Philadelphia with fascination. Could colonies in the Americas rise against mighty European powers and succeed? One of the most famous inspired figures was Simón Bolívar, born in Venezuela. Bolívar carried with him a copy of the U.S. Constitution and studied the American example closely. He admired George Washington's leadership and the idea that people could govern themselves. Bolívar dreamed of a free and united Latin America, a vision he called Gran Colombia. In the South, José de San Martín led the fight for independence in Argentina, Chile, and Peru. Like Bolívar, he drew inspiration from the American struggle, adapting its ideals to the local context. Revolutions in Latin America were shaped not only by military strategy but also by the philosophy of liberty, equality, and self-determination demonstrated in the United States. By the 1820s, most Spanish colonies in South America had won independence. Each new nation followed its own path, but the spark from Philadelphia was unmistakable. The American Revolution had shown that empires could be challenged and that ordinary citizens could rise to reshape the world. Latin American leaders often referenced America as a moral and political example. Constitutions were drafted, governments formed, and the idea of a republic, once a distant concept, became a reality in lands that had been under colonial rule for centuries. The American example proved that revolution was not just a European phenomenon. It was a global language of freedom, a message that even distant continents could understand and act upon. The Haitian Revolution, liberty in chains broken. While the American Revolution proclaimed freedom, it also revealed its contradictions. The liberty celebrated in Philadelphia did not extend to enslaved Africans or indigenous peoples. Yet, even in these exclusions, revolutionary ideas traveled, ideas that would ignite one of the most extraordinary uprisings in history. In Saint-Domingue, the richest French colony in the Caribbean, enslaved Africans toiled under brutal conditions on sugar and coffee plantations. Inspired by the American Declaration of Independence and the revolutionary ideals of France, they began to question their bondage. Leaders like Toussaint Louverture, a former slave, rose with vision, intelligence, and extraordinary courage. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791, became a struggle not only for freedom from colonial rule but for human dignity itself. Despite facing European armies, including Napoleon's forces, the enslaved population fought tirelessly, transforming their fight into a movement that would inspire the oppressed worldwide. By 1804, Haiti declared independence, becoming the first black republic in the world. This was a monumental moment. Enslaved people had not only rebelled but successfully established a nation based on liberty. The revolution sent shockwaves across the Americas, alarming slaveholding societies but also offering hope that freedom could be seized against tremendous odds. Haiti's victory was proof that the ideals of liberty were universal. While America had inspired the world, Haiti demonstrated that freedom could not be confined by race or social class. The revolutionary flame now burned in every corner of the Atlantic world, spreading the message. Oppression could be challenged, and humanity could claim its rights. The Haitian Revolution thus stands as a direct extension of the global impact of American independence, showing that revolutionary ideas could empower the powerless and redefine the concept of FRE. Ripples in Europe, the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. The ideas born in Philadelphia did not stay in the Americas. Across Europe, citizens and intellectuals watched the American Revolution with fascination. It demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge entrenched powers, inspiring movements decades later. In 1830, France experienced its July Revolution, overthrowing King Charles X and replacing him with a constitutional monarchy under Louis Philippe. Liberal and nationalist movements spread to Belgium and Poland, fueled by the ideals of self-rule and popular sovereignty first articulated in America. 18 years later, 1848 saw a wave of revolutions sweep across Europe, from Paris to Berlin, Vienna to Milan. Workers, students, and intellectuals demanded constitutions, parliaments, and civil rights. Monarchs were forced to negotiate or flee. While many of these uprisings were eventually suppressed, the revolutionary spirit persisted. The American Revolution served as both symbol and precedent. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches cited Philadelphia as proof that change was possible. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels observed these upheavals, noting the global resonance of revolutionary ideals. These European revolutions, though distinct, shared a philosophical lineage with America's struggle. The belief that government exists to serve the people, not the other way around. Liberty, equality, and the right to self-determination had become universal demands, echoing the bold claims of 1776. The ripples from America's independence thus transformed Europe's political landscape, planting seeds that would influence liberal reforms, nationalist movements, and debates over human rights for generations to come. Asia looks west, early echoes in India and China. While the Atlantic world buzzed with revolutions, the ideas of American independence slowly crossed oceans to Asia, reaching lands under colonial rule or ancient monarchies. Though the impact was delayed, its influence was profound for intellectuals and reformers seeking change. In India, thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy studied Western political ideas, including the principles behind the American Revolution. They were inspired by the notions of liberty, constitutional government, and individual rights. Though India would not gain independence for nearly 2 centuries, the seeds of self-determination were planted early, echoing the American call for governance by the consent of the governed. In China, reform-minded scholars observed the success of the American colonies with fascination. While imperial China remained under strict monarchical control, the concepts of democracy and natural rights influenced thinkers like Sun Yat-sen, who later led revolutionary movements to overthrow the Qing dynasty. The idea that people could challenge entrenched power and shape their nation resonated deeply, even in a society far removed geographically from Philadelphia. The ripple effect extended across the continent. Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia also witnessed discussions about governance, rights, and the responsibilities of rulers. Though the adoption of American-style democracy was uneven and delayed, the revolution's philosophical legacy inspired debates about liberty, justice, and national sovereignty. American independence thus became more than a local or regional event. It offered a global blueprint for challenging empires, questioning authority, and imagining societies built on the principles of self-rule. Asia, though distant, felt the echo of Philadelphia's call for freedom. Africa and the seeds of decolonization. The revolutionary spirit that began in America and spread to Europe and Latin America eventually reached Africa, though its impact would unfold over a longer timeline. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, European powers controlled vast swathes of African territory, exploiting resources and people. Yet the ideas of liberty, self-determination, and resistance to colonial authority slowly found their way across the continent. The Haitian Revolution played a particularly significant role. News of enslaved Africans successfully overthrowing their colonial masters reverberated across the Atlantic. African leaders and intellectuals saw that rebellion could triumph, planting early seeds for the eventual anti-colonial and independence movements of the 20th century. Even in regions where direct influence was minimal, African thinkers and traders carried the news of American independence. Stories of the Declaration's ideals and the Revolutionary War's victories circulated in coastal trading hubs, inspiring hope for a future where Africans could govern themselves. The American Revolution also influenced Pan-African thought. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta, generations later, would draw upon these examples when articulating visions of independence and unity. The principles of human rights and self-rule, first widely proclaimed in 1776, became touchstones for African liberation struggles centuries later. Thus, American independence was not only a historical event, it was the first spark in a chain reaction that challenged imperial domination across continents. Africa, like other regions, began to imagine a world where people could reclaim their destinies and break free from foreign rule. The American example, ideals, and contradictions. The success of the American Revolution created a powerful example. A nation founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and self-governance. Across the world, people looked to the United States as proof that ordinary citizens could challenge empires and establish democratic institutions. Yet, the American model was far from perfect. While the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, enslaved Africans, Native Americans, and women were excluded from these rights. Slavery persisted for nearly a century after independence, and racial inequality remained deeply entrenched. Women, despite playing crucial roles in revolutionary efforts, were denied political participation. These contradictions did not diminish the global impact of the revolution, but they added complexity. For reformers abroad, the American example became both inspiration and caution. It showed that freedom was achievable, yet also that realizing it fully required persistent struggle. Despite its flaws, the American Revolution introduced concepts that would shape constitutions, legal systems, and human rights movements around the world. From Latin America to Europe, Asia, and Africa, leaders cited the United States when arguing for democracy, civil liberties, and national sovereignty. In essence, the revolution offered a blueprint for freedom, even as it revealed that liberty was an evolving process, not a finished product. It taught the world that ideas alone could spark revolutions, but sustained effort was necessary to translate ideals into reality. The 20th century Wilson, Roosevelt, and global freedom movements. The ideals of the American Revolution, liberty, self-determination, and democracy, resonated far beyond the 18th century. In the 20th century, they shaped global politics and inspired leaders worldwide. President Woodrow Wilson, during World War I, invoked the principles of self-determination in his 14 points, advocating for nations under colonial rule to have a voice in their governance. Though Wilson's vision was imperfect and selectively applied, it reflected the enduring influence of 1776, that the legitimacy of government comes from the consent of the governed. During World War II, Franklin D. Roosevelt articulated the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. These ideals echoed the American Revolution's vision, linking domestic principles of liberty to a global struggle against tyranny. Allied forces fought not just against military conquest but for the preservation of human rights and democratic governance worldwide. The American example also inspired anti-colonial and independence movements across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ho Chi Minh studied America's revolution, learning lessons about organizing resistance, uniting diverse populations, and articulating principles that could mobilize global support. Even after centuries, the revolutionary flame that began in Philadelphia spread across oceans, igniting hope for freedom and self-rule. The United States became a symbol, not always perfect, but undeniably influential, demonstrating that ordinary people could challenge entrenched power and reshape the world. The legacy of American independence in the 20th century proved one vital truth. Ideas of liberty are timeless, crossing borders, languages, and cultures, inspiring generations to fight for justice and self-determination. the torch of liberty across the world. The story of American independence did not end with the signing of a document or the surrender of British forces. Its impact rippled across centuries and continents, becoming a guiding light for movements of freedom and self-determination everywhere. From the hills of Latin America to the plantations of Haiti, the streets of Paris, and the salons of Europe, the ideals of liberty, equality, and democracy spread like wildfire. Revolutions and reform movements, inspired by the example of the United States, reshaped nations and societies. People who had once accepted their fate began to imagine a world where governments served the people, not the other way around. Yet, the journey was never straightforward. Revolutions brought victory and terror, hope and contradiction. In America, liberty coexisted with slavery. In France, freedom emerged amid bloodshed. In Haiti, emancipation demanded unimaginable struggle. These complexities reminded the world that freedom is not a gift. It is a pursuit, often fraught with challenges and setbacks. In the centuries that followed, American independence continued to inspire leaders, thinkers, and ordinary citizens. From Wilson and Roosevelt to Gandhi, Nkrumah, and Ho Chi Minh, the principles first articulated in Philadelphia provided both moral guidance and a practical example of how people could challenge power. Constitutions, declarations of rights, and democratic institutions around the globe trace their lineage to the revolutionary ideas of 1776. Today, the legacy of American independence remains a living force. It reminds the world that ordinary people, armed with ideas and courage, can alter the course of history. It shows that liberty, once ignited, can cross oceans, break chains, and inspire generations far beyond its origin.